So as I was being introduced, I heard someone crying. I see someone sleeping in the audience. It's wonderful to be around young families. It's a pleasure to be here. A little correction, I've come in from the Slovak Republic, not the Czech Republic. And I was reflecting on the way here. So every morning I do devotions, and then after devotions I do about half an hour of secular reading, typically anything from the 19th century and earlier. And I just read William Shakespeare. You may know him; he's one of your own. Um, I was reading Hamlet, and there's a scene where Hamlet is speaking with a grave digger, and the grave digger doesn't recognize him, and he's talking about how he's gone to England because he's gone crazy. And Hamlet asks, "Well, what happens if he doesn't get better?" And they say, the gravedigger responds, "Well, everyone in England is crazy already. No one will notice." So as a crazy foreigner coming to this land, I hope that remains true. As I was walking in, I saw there was Daniel's Den, and it reminded me of a story from law school. I went to a Christian law school in the 1990s, and we had by 1990 standards, a woke speaker, even though woke wasn't a term back then. And our professor quipped that we were feeding the lion to the Christians. And, you know, like David's mighty men, we are lions, and we have to attack issues of education like lions. And I encourage you to do that. So we'll start with this slide, that law is downstream of culture, and we must tackle the culture and the law. Every law, whether we like it or not, has a moral fabric to it. There's moral substance to it. Even our speeding laws are based on a morality that life is worthy of protection. So there's not one single law you could think of that's not based on some morality. The question is, whose morality? And we are living at a time, I was having a conversation earlier this morning, we are living out the poisonous fruits of the sexual revolution. So what was countercultural there back then is now the culture. So much so that it is being taught as reality and celebrated in our classrooms. And our parliament has passed laws to make sure that free love and things like that become part of our moral fabric. And that is a reflection that, through those years, those decades, the philosophies that preceded that to now, we are living in a world where law has now codified a morality that is very different from the one that Christians have, and very dangerous for the moral upbringing and the chances of raising our children in a world where their salvation will be assured. And that makes you, in many ways, the guarantor of through God's grace, of your children's future. So it's a high and mighty task, and as a parent myself, it's one that I know we all take seriously. So what is the hurdle? What is the obstacle that we're dealing with? This is a picture that I personally took, so that's why the quality isn't so great. Back pre-COVID, when RSE was just being put on the books and they were writing up the guidance for the schools, this is the Department for Education on Westminster. You see no Union Jacks, you see no other symbols except 2 floors of a pride flag, which is a bit startling. It takes you back a little bit because a flag is a symbol of the authority we acknowledge. And that was the authority of the day, and I still believe it is today, of the Department for Education. Back in that day, if you were to get an email from someone from the Department of Education, this is the email signature that you would see. As you can see, it's "I am an LGBT plus champion." Pronouns, she, her, for the person writing the email. And a little note there, Stonewall had his fingerprints all over the rollout of RSEE, and this is proof of that. And this is the education we are giving our children. We are feeding them that whatever you want your sexual orientation to be is fine. We are feeding them that whatever your gender identity may be, that's fine, and we'll celebrate you for it. And in fact, we'll encourage you towards that direction, whether your parents want that to be the case or not. And we've seen that in schools across the country. These are actual resources being used in schools across England. This is a slide which actually predates RSE from a school that I'll talk about in a little while towards the end of the presentation, Heaver's Farm in Croydon. It's a picture, we blurred out the face of the young girl on the website. It's since been removed since this litigation was brought by Christian Concern against the school. But this girl was proudly displayed, face and all, on the Heaver website where she's writing, "I have a dream. If boys could go to the same toilet as girls." This is year one. What 6-year-old do you know has that dream on her own? That's the power of education. As Aristotle said, give me a child up until he's 7 and I'll show you the man. Voices chanting, doggies panting. Clad in leather, perfect weather. Dancers jumping, music pumping. Loving kisses, so delicious. This is a storybook celebrating the Stonewall riots. I know it is part of the library of at least one school in England, perhaps more. It's an award-winning book about LGBT relationships and how we should celebrate them, packaged beautifully for children with lots of colors and hearts and things to capture the imagination and the hearts and minds of our young ones. So what is RSE? So back in 2019, there was an amendment made to Section 34.3 of the Children and Social Welfare Act, which said that pupils must learn about safety, informing and maintaining relationships. That's relationships education. The characteristics of healthy relationships, and how relationships may affect physical and mental health and well-being. So none of that sounds particularly nefarious. And back in the early stages of all of this, before the activists got involved and the quote-unquote woke politicians, it wasn't particularly nefarious. There was caveats put in that the education must be appropriate, having regard to the age and religious background of the pupils. Now, in any of the cases in your children's schools where there's been material which you have felt as parents was age inappropriate, you knowing your children better than anyone else, has the school ever said, well, when we developed this material, we were having due regard for the religious background of our pupils? It's just dead letter, this safeguard that was put into both this act and into the Education Act as well, as is age appropriateness, because that is not defined anywhere in law. It is almost like it's in the eyes of the beholder, with a tremendous discretion afforded to the schools, when it really should be about the subjective views of the child and how it affects that child, knowing that some children are more sensitive than others. Sure, some children are growing up in progressive households, but that shouldn't mean that we are to sacrifice our children because of those few children and have them viewing stuff that's clearly going to have a developmental effect on their moral compass. Now, the regulations use identical language when they were transposed into the Education Act, except they add this one caveat, that the nature of marriage and civil partnership and their importance for family life and the bringing up of children must be discussed with pupils. So this is what they hooked LGBT education on. This last bit that wasn't in the original law, but made it into the Education Act. And who are the people providing RSE material, and who were the people who were informing the parliamentary discussions when this law was being passed? I ask you to recall this slide for later in the presentation, and the actors that are involved in this. You may know some of them. The Proud Trust, Stonewall, Educate and Celebrate. So these are among the worst offenders who are teaching us to smash heteronormativity in our primary schools, who are asking us not to reflect what the law says, but what they aspire it to be in regard to gender reassignment and what our children should be learning about sexual orientation. So it's not about, let's not discriminate based on sexual orientation. It is, let us celebrate different sexual orientations. Nick Gibb, who is the Minister of School Standards, back in 2019 during a House of Commons hearing period, responded to a question thus: what we are clear about is that children must be taught about LGBT relationships and that they must be taught the relationships curriculum. No other government have delivered such a policy. It is the right policy, but I strongly believe that it needs to have all the consensus of the religious organizations as well as Stonewall to enable it to land effectively in our schools. And I believe that it is landing successfully in our schools. Well, it's landed like a lead balloon in our schools, to be honest. And why on earth we would put a activist campaign organization like Stonewall on an equal setting with religious organizations says a lot about that statement. And in fact, since that statement, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. Here is a startling statistic, and I'll share another statistic later on regarding gender identity and gender confusion in our children. But there is a contagion that comes from teaching libertinism in our schools. And these statistics relating to bisexuality are shocking. They are shocking, and it shows you the power of education. It shows you the power of having an authority figure who has our children in their classroom for large portions of the week, telling them that this is how life is and we should celebrate it. And when we are in our peer group, and that is what they're getting, it is being screamed at us from culture, on our tablets, in front of our TVs, on our smartphones, and now in the classroom. Christy Higgs is one of the cases that Christian Legal Center has supported. Christy was not a teacher, but she worked in pastoral care in a school here in England. And on her private Facebook, so this was not shared to the public, it was using her maiden name and nowhere mentioned the school where she worked, shared two posts. One was sharing a petition saying that Parliament needs to discuss opt-outs regarding RSE, because currently, as was the case then, is still the case now, there is no opt-out for relationships education. It must be taught at the primary level, at the secondary level, whether it's an independent school, a maintained school, it must be taught. There's no right of opt-out. Sexual education is a different thing. I'll talk about that a bit later. But this petition was to say, hey, we need opt-outs for this because some of this is really encroaching on not only parental rights, but is approaching sexual education, because what we're seeing in particularly activist schools is they're putting material that should rightly be put in sexual education and labeling it as relationships education so that we cannot opt our children out of it. So she posted that petition, and that petition garnered a significant amount of signatures, well over 50,000, so much so that it did trigger a debate in Parliament over the right of opt-out. The second was something about some of the materials that were being taught in our schools, and she simply said, my goodness, what are we teaching our kids? It was an American thing that she sent forward, but that's all she did. It was just those two posts on her private Facebook. And for that, she was called into a disciplinary meeting that took several hours. Her Christian views were compared to Nazism and other totalitarian beliefs. And she was terminated from her job. And that case remains before an employment tribunal. So not only do they want our kids forced to observe this stuff and have it in their classrooms, they are punishing anyone who tries to say this isn't right. And Christy, I've met her a number of times. We've spoken at events together. She is the shyest person you've ever met. She's a lamb. And the school treated her more roughly than any human being deserves. And so I'd ask you to pray for Christy as her case develops. Procedurally, it's a fascinating case. I've never been part of a case where on two occasions they've had to set aside the case because of, they found out at some point that someone involved in the case had views which were very pro-LGBT and which disqualified them because their impartiality was completely wrecked. Never seen that before. So she's a fighter, and I believe at the end of the day we'll win that case. As I was saying, that this idea of age appropriateness has been lost. It's become dead letter, and so much so that the Prime Minister has launched a review of sex education in schools, and I can tell you that as someone who deals with this on a day-to-day basis, some of the things I see come across my desk, examples for primary schools of depictions of fully naked adults, fully nude adults, in positions which reflect sexual positions. That's stuff that they're wanting to show our primary school kids. Imagine what they're showing our secondary school kids. So as more and more of these tales have come out, the government has been forced to act, again, making a mockery of what Nick Gibbs said during question hour, or during the question period in the House of Commons. So let's talk about your rights, because that's important. We always talk about the rights of those who are teaching LGBT, the activists, and those that we need to be teaching this stuff. It's a human right to be teaching this stuff. Well, they never talk about your rights. Section 9 of the Education Act says, in exercising or performing all of their respective powers and duties under the Education Acts, the Secretary of State and local authorities shall have regard to the general principle that pupils are to be educated in accordance with whose wishes? With parents' wishes. Now, how often do we actually see that? When we make our wishes clear, we're told, sorry, you don't have a voice here. It's been decided by the Department for Education. It's been decided by the local authority. We are teaching this whether you like it or not, and you don't have a right to opt out. And sometimes they don't even tell you. Often they don't even tell you what's being taught. You find out after the fact because there's so little transparency in so many of our schools. And I don't want to throw all our schools under the bus. I don't want to throw all our teachers under the bus because there are many, many excellent schools and many excellent teachers there. But there's enough out there who are ideological, or who aren't necessarily ideological, but because they want to pass their Ofsted inspection or their independent school inspection, they take on what the local authority is giving them, and the local authority is giving them what those organizations in that slide I showed you are providing them. They're taking on the advice of those organizations, so they're not getting the law. They're getting what those organizations want the law to be, and perception becomes reality. And we are running our schools as if that is the law when it's not the law. Protocol 1, Article 2, my favorite of the European Convention of Human Rights. And I have litigated Protocol 1, Article 2 cases throughout my career, my 20-year career, for homeschooling families and Christian schools across Europe, from Sweden to Germany and the United Kingdom as well. What it says is that the school, and by extension, the state, so the government, and by extension, individual schools, have an obligation to respect you and the way you want to raise your children in accordance with your religious and philosophical convictions. That means that they cannot provide an education which makes it impossible for you to raise your kids as Christians according to the morality you want to teach them. It means that they cannot indoctrinate, that anything they teach must be objective, it must be critical, and it must be pluralistic. That's the standard that the European Court of Human Rights has set in a case called Kujelson. It was upheld in Fulgero by the Grand Chamber. Education must be objective, critical, and pluralistic. It must be age appropriate. It can't focus too heavily on an individual subject like relationships education in a manner that will obviously tip the scales in favor of a child following the worldview that's being put out there. So this is something that if it happens in your schools, you can go to court and say the school has breached my Protocol 1, Article 2 rights by not respecting the way I want to raise my child as a Christian. And we have had those cases, and those cases will be on the increase in the years to come. So what the regulations also say is that for sex education, you have a right of opt-out. So for primary schools, that right is absolute. Primary schools don't have an obligation to teach sexual education. They can if they want, but there is a right of opt-out. For secondary schools, there is a scenario where a head teacher can stop it in exceptional circumstances. Again, the legislation doesn't say what exceptional circumstances are. That's not been tested by the courts because thankfully I don't know of any situation where a head teacher has exercised that right to stop a parent from opting out. But to be clear, you have a right of opting your children out of sexual education. And I would use that as a sword, that when your schools start teaching material which should properly be in sexual education as part of relationships education, you say, wait, just because you branded it this way doesn't make it something that it's not. And we want a right of opt-out. And we've had success with that model in some schools in the United Kingdom. You have a right to be consulted. Every time a school updates its RSE policy or drafts a new one, you have a right to be consulted. You have a right to see the materials that are going to be presented to your children and the modules that they'll be seeing, and you need to exercise that right because there are a lot of schools out there who, for one reason or not, don't want to show you that. And that is, to me, the most suspect thing I could think of. Why would they want to be hiding what they're teaching your children? And if that is the case, please call us immediately and we'll send out a legal letter to them saying you have an obligation here. Show us what you got, because we have other options. We can home educate, we can put our children in another school, in a Christian school. So if you're not going to show us what you've got, then we're going to make problems for you. So that is a right you have. What does the guidance say about what Christian schools and individual Christian teachers can say about Christian matters? So paragraph 21 of the guidance for RSE states that all schools may teach about faith perspectives. In particular, schools with a religious character may teach the distinctive faith perspective on relationships, and balanced debate may take place about issues that are seen as contentious. So if you do attend, if your children do attend a Christian school, or if you're a proprietor of a Christian school, or a teacher, whether in a Christian school or not, because the guidance elsewhere says that as an individual teacher, you have the same right to share your specifically Christian viewpoint on these issues, so long as you don't undermine the law or the other points of the guidance and the statutory regulations. Similarly, the Equality Act guidance that was given to schools back in 2014 states that schools with a religious character, like all schools, have a responsibility for the welfare of the children in their care and to adhere to curriculum guidance. So that's similar to what the RSHE guidance has taught. But it says also that it's not the intention of the department or the government to undermine the ethos of a Christian school. So use this guidance, please. Ensure that your children's schools, whether you're having children attend or you're the proprietor of one, that they are using these, because these are powerful. And there are faith schools, Church of England schools top on the list, who are not teaching our children in accordance with Christian doctrine. They are among the worst offenders when it comes to promoting sexual orientation, celebrating homosexuality, and promoting gender identity as if it was a legal obligation. So pride. This is something that many parents are dealing with. It's coming up more and more. In some schools, we're seeing that they're raising money for LGBT charities and having children wear rainbow laces, things like that. They're actually having pride events on the school premises. They're coloring LGBT symbols, rainbows. That's happening in our schools. Another pseudo-pride celebration, we have school diversity weeks, where the teaching is heavy on LGBT elements. As many as half of all schools may be marking or celebrating Pride during the school day in the month of June, or LGBTQ plus History Month in February. We've had reports coming in from Christian teachers and parents all over the country who are hearing that we are celebrating sexual identities for children under the name of diversity. And that, to me, is the Trojan horse. diversity means sexual diversity. If we are having a pride event celebrating diversity, that means we are celebrating LGBT, because that is, for certain people, the archetype of diversity and equality. It is LGBT. And I remember in this case, the Izzy Montague case, where all of this was happening in one primary school, and this was before RSE. Izzy Montague had moved to Croydon with her family, her husband Shane, and they put their youngest into a primary school. In age 4, he began school, and at that age, he was required to participate in a gay pride event held by the school. He was forced to color rainbows and other LGBT symbols, and told that this was a showing of symbolic support for the wider LGBT community. That was what was written in the lesson plan, the purpose of it. They were taught three songs, 2 of which were gay anthems, which were projected on that day on a rainbow-colored theme. The keynote speaker of the day was an openly gay MP, and photos of that day show teachers wearing LGBT campaigning shirts, big rainbow flags everywhere. All the kids were dressed in rainbow colors. If that is not indoctrination, I don't know what is. And in the lower court, when this was heard by the county court, the judge said, "No, this is just diversity. There's no LGBT indoctrination here." Well, any person coming off of the street looking at that will say that is a gay pride parade. That's how those kids are going to grow up learning to celebrate pride. If you tell me that a 4-year-old starting school there, by the end of their primary education, exposed to that year after year after year, is not going to come out of that school and be an LGBT ally, then you're kidding yourself. So that this case is on appeal, but that to me is the state of some of our schools, and something that, ask your kids what they're being taught, because Izzy found out about this days before the Pride event. She didn't even know that her son was being forced to color LGBT symbols, and that he was being taught this stuff. Nigel and Sally Rowe. We'll see if this video works.
Good morning. A Christian couple are threatening to take their 6-year-old son's school to a tribunal because another pupil sometimes comes to class as a boy and other times as a girl wearing a dress.
We were some of the first to raise concerns about transgenderism in schools. At the time, not everybody understood why we were taking a stand, but 4 years on, I think we can all see where this ideology has taken us.
4 years ago, a 6-year-old child in our son's class was sometimes coming to school as a boy and then sometimes coming as a girl, as he saw fit. We were stunned to hear that our son could be disciplined if he wouldn't recognise the boy as a real girl. And this was happening in our local Church of England primary school, a school we had enthusiastically supported previously. We felt we had to home educate our children because of the school's extreme position. The media coverage was astonishing, but a wonderful opportunity to speak the truth on TV, that God's plan for our lives is best, and that transgender ideology is actually harmful.
We've been hard at work now for 4 years and supporting Nigel and Sally to help them make the best possible case that the transgender policies of schools are not harmless. They're not harmless. We've secured well over 100 pages of evidence from experts around the UK and around the world, demonstrating that affirming a child's transgender identity does more harm than good. Standing with Nigel and Sally to take their case forward doesn't just help their children or others who are being forced to go along with this lie. It helps the gender-confused children themselves and all those around them. It's a brave step for Nigel and Sally and these experts to take, but it's essential. We must expose the damage that's being done by this ideology to our children, to families, to communities, to school communities. The truly compassionate approach, the truly loving approach, the truly truthful approach is to expose the ideology for what it is and help those that are caught up in it to see the truth.
It has been a long time, but it has been worth it. We are really glad that now we are able to move our challenge forward.
This isn't just about our children or our school. It's about challenging guidance that's used around the country that denies the reality of biological sex, and it also leads to long-term harm.
Nigel and Sally were one of my first cases at Christian Concern when I began there a number of years ago. This was before any of us had an idea of what was coming our way with regard to gender identity. So Nigel and Sally, on the Isle of Wight, the picturesque, beautiful Isle of Wight, had two young children in primary school. They were growing up with the other kids in the school, and they came to start school one year. The children were 6 and 8 at the time, and two of their friends, they found out, were now identifying as girls. And the teachers were telling them they are to be taught as girls. You're supposed to use the appropriate pronouns. When Nigel and Sally inquired by way of letter what this was all about, they were told by their Church of England school that the failure to recognize these children as girls was homophobic. And we will treat it as homophobia, and this has the full support of the diocese. And we will ensure that we will teach your kids better, to know better, and to not be transphobic. So they pulled their children out of school. Eventually, a judicial review was brought a few years later. To be fair, it was brought. The government settled the case, and as you know, they are now coming up with new guidance, and that is partly thanks to Sally and Nigel Rowe, who bravely stepped out and put their private lives and their well-being on the line. Back when this came out, and they were going on TV, they were the villains. I remember doing some interviews as well on the case, and I was the villain, saying, how could you do these to these poor young children? Gender reassignment is a very specific legal term. It relates to those who, with full capacity and full emotional development, make the decision to live their life out as a different sex. You need Gillick competency. It does not apply to young children. Gender identity, which is the perception of how we see ourselves in our gender, is not gender reassignment. And the two are being conflated in our schools. And that has resulted in social transitioning, which the Caste Review has said is not a neutral act. And why would it be a neutral act? If you're coming in day after day, and your teachers and your peers are affirming you as a gender that is different from your biological sex, that is going to have an effect on your mental development. And what we've seen is this stuff in our schools. Gender identity is a philosophy. It is not, again, it is not gender reassignment. There is no protected characteristic of gender identity. The courts have recognized it as a philosophical belief. So they are teaching this, as political as it is, to our children as facts. They're dressing it up with nice little unicorns and rainbows. And that's what our kids are learning. They're being read these books. My Little Princess Boy. This is a popular one in our schools. And what we've seen, if you go back to 2009, the year before the Equality Act went into force, and this wasn't in our schools, they had an average of between 90 and 97 kids a year being referred to gender identity clinics. You want to know what that number is now? It's over 2,000 kids every year. That is contagion. That is the power of ideology in education, and that is taking advantage of young, sensitive hearts and minds. And those are only the kids who are in serious enough condition that they are being sent to gender identity clinics. The social transitioning has become the norm. And I'll tell you what, I was reading this yesterday, and it's very welcome. So there's inequality legislation, because this is the what we talk about all the time. Equality is king in our country. We live in an equal country. Um, there are three things you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to discriminate based on a protected characteristic. You're not allowed to victimize based on a protected characteristic. And that one we could set aside because that deals with when someone does a protected act, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about here today. And the third is you cannot harass someone because of a protected characteristic. So harassment, and not a lot of people know this, and you should, when it comes to gender identity, sexual orientation, and religion or belief, is not in the act. So you cannot be guilty of harassing someone in the education environment on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. The Equality Commission came out just this week and said, and this will be surprising to many of you, and I was surprised when I read it, but that you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender reassignment when it comes to a pupil because they do not have the capacity to be gender reassigned. So misgendering is not discrimination when it's done in the schools. And even if it did come within the purview of gender reassignment, under the Human Rights Act, those are all qualified rights. The right to manifest your gender identity is a qualified right. And if you are putting conditions on that right for the health and safety of that specific child, for safeguarding purposes, or for the rights of others, because gender reassignment pervades the entire school community. It is the day-by-day affirmation of a philosophy. It goes into our changing rooms, into our toileting facilities. It goes into requiring us, by shaming us into believing that someone is a different biological sex than they are. And we now know that that is not discrimination. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a big, big step forward. Calvin and Nicola Watts, who I believe may be here. Are you here today? We've met on Zoom, but never in person. They have firsthand seen what this is in their Church of England school and bravely stood up and, like the Rose, faced the slings and arrows of an angry, woke society and done so with much integrity, and God bless you for it. And please speak to them during the breaks and find out their story because it's a powerful one. Now, according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the United States, as many as 98% of gender-confused boys and 88% of gender-confused girls eventually accept their biological sex after naturally passing through puberty. Those numbers, as put out by the NHS, are a little bit lower. They're around 80%, but they're still incredibly high. And I think that would reflect, again, this idea that less kids now are accepting their biological sex because of that affirmation they're getting in their schools, for months, months, years. That has an effect. But if we let our kids naturally pass through puberty, they are going to come out on the other side okay. And puberty is not a disease that needs to be suppressed. And the American College of Pediatricians has said that conditioning children into believing a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex is normal and helpful is child abuse. And I agree. And the suicidality rate and the self-harming rate of those who have gender dysphoria among our young ones is astronomical. And the fact that we have the number that we have of kids going to gender identity clinics who are self-harming has created a safeguarding crisis for this generation. We have helped teachers. Hannah is the anonymous name of a teacher we're currently helping. She is a Christian who took issue with a specific child based on their circumstances, finding that this child had expressed a doubt about their gender identity, that they were shy, that they had behavioral issues, that they had to leave their previous schools because of behavioral issues, that there were comorbidities that made it a safeguarding risk to treat this child as something other than the biological sex they were. She whistle blew. The local authority who was giving advice on this, Stonewall trained. So those folks in that earlier slide, that's where they're getting their advice. They were Stonewall champions. That was on their email header as well. So the people meant to be safeguarding our kids are the problem and not the solution. And Hannah is currently in the courts fighting for her job, for standing up for what was right, for standing up, for being the only one to stand up for this young child. Joshua Sutcliffe is someone who many of you may know. He was let go from his job in Oxford for allegedly misgendering a pupil when he said after a maths problem to some kids, "Well done, girls." And that was considered misgendering because one of them identified as a boy. And he was recently struck off by the Teaching Regulation Authority and never allowed to teach again. So, the good news, as I've said, and this will be appealed, is that this is no longer the case. Misgendering is no longer a hate crime. It's no longer discrimination. Now, the courts have warned that you're not allowed to misgender with impunity, but as Christians who have a loving view of this and who say we're all created equally in God's dignity and image, in God's image, we all have equal dignity, we will love that child, but we will not disavow God's creation order. And I will love you, but I cannot participate in this. That is a principle that we must stick to and is finally gaining traction. Dr. Bernard Randall, this goes to wokeness. He was a school chaplain in a well-known upscale school in England who gave a sermon during chapel about challenging, not saying, the Christian view was the only view, but saying challenge your perceptions. That wokeness may not be all it is cracked up to be. Follow your own hearts. It was an even-tempered message. And for that, he was not only fired, but he was that they made a recommendation to the what's the anti-terror, the group Prevent. He was referred to Prevent for giving that sermon, and he is currently before the employment tribunal as well. Part of the problem, part of the problem is our judges are equally woke. They came out of the schools in the 60s and 70s, and so they're not coming to these cases with a fresh mind either. And so we really knew we have lost a lot of ground, folks, and we need to reclaim that for Christ. So how can you, as parents, successfully raise your voice? Be engaged and involved, knowing what is going on in your child's education and appreciating your teachers. So appreciate your teachers. I mean, it is a tough job. It is not an easy job, and many of them want to do well by your kids, and they've gotten into the profession because they genuinely love the profession. Appreciate what they do, but also watch what your kids are learning, because not all of the teachers, like in any profession, share the same beliefs or worldview that we have, and some of them, in fact, want to raise your kids entirely differently. I remember back in the Izzy Montague case when we were looking at Discovery, one of the emails from the head teacher to another parent who was an LGBT supporter was saying about Izzy that she was a horrible person and that the school will do everything in their power to make sure that the other kids in the school don't grow up believing what she believes, meaning having Christian beliefs. And on cross-examination, not only did that head teacher, but her entire leadership team, when cross-examined on what homophobia was and asked about different Christian positions, said categorically that each one of those Christian positions was homophobic. That is an incredibly large, it's a federated school, hundreds and hundreds of children, and that's the leadership team for those two schools, and that's replicated across the country. Start to process any issue in the least confrontational and most personal way. So at first instance, don't write an email. If you can, go and talk to your teachers. Most of them aren't ideological. Some of them are doing this because they've been told by the local authority or Stonewall that this is the way it is. And if you're reasonable with them, you can often solve things at that level. Know your school policies. There's always a complaint policy. If you can't deal with things at that first level with the teacher, file a formal complaint. It'll go to the head teacher and then after to the governors. And thereafter, you can continue on up to the point of judicially reviewing a decision or going to court, as we did in the Montague case. Know your rights in the law. Protocol 1, Article 2. Remember that. That's your homework for today. Protocol 1, Article 2. That the school cannot undermine your ability as parents to raise your kids as Christians. Escalate to the department head, the head teacher, and the chair of governors when necessary. In the most egregious of situations, report to Ofsted or the ISI, to the local authority, the LADO, which is the designated safeguarding officer for the local authority, the Multi-Academy Trust, and we've done this a number of times, the Department for Education, because the Department of Education actually has a power embedded within the Education Act, which allows them to intervene in a particular school if they are not following their statutory obligations or if they are acting unreasonably. Lastly, get advice. Christian Concern is one organization that provides advice. Christian Institute, there are others. A lot of us out there, a lot of us here in this room at these stands go speak at lunchtime, and I'll finish on time so that you can get your lunch. Because I know that the only thing standing between you and lunch is me. I'm keenly aware of that. So I'm coming to among my last slides here. Be an Issachar people for the sake of our children. You are the number one influence in your child's life. You always will be, hopefully. That's an honored position. And I know back to this image of a lion. We are lions when it comes to our children, and we need to protect them because this world is not, for those of us in our 40s, 50s, later years, it's not the world we grew up in, not by a long shot. We need to protect our kids. You have an influential voice at your school, and the more parents you can have on your side, the more influential that voice will be. Speak up to your school and at your school. Home education is always an option, and as much as I love Slovakia, I'm an advisor to the Prime Minister's Office on Religious Freedom and International Law. I work with our Commissioner of Children to keep our schools safe in Slovakia. And I'll say this is just a little prop to my home country. We're the only country in Europe that not only does not have relationships education, we don't even have sex education. But we don't have home education. So, it's never utopia wherever you're at. Home education in this country is among the freest in the world. There are certainly forces which are trying to change that, but right now that remains the case. Remain vigilant, watching out for those forces, but home education is a great option for those who use it. There is a new movement of independent Christian schools which are amazing. They are keenly aware of what is required and what is fluff, what is not required, but they're putting in the regulations to say you should be teaching it. So they've spoken to lawyers knowing that there is a big difference when the regulations say you must teach this versus you should teach this, because they want you to be confused. As a normal head teacher or governor, you're reading this saying, well, you should be teaching this. You don't know that means that it's optional, because it's put right next to a sentence which says you must be teaching it. It's all lumped in there. It's confusing, but know those differences, and these schools do. State and independent school teachers, they are the salt and light in the system. If you know of young people who are wanting to get in the profession, who have a heart for Christ, encourage them to do so, because they are our frontline fighters. There are many wonderful educational organizations passionate about Christ. Again, speak to the people in this room at the stands and learn about what they're doing. And churches, please get on your feet. Talk about these issues. The reason we have same-sex marriage in this country is because the churches weren't activated. They did not speak up. And whether you agree with same-sex marriage or not, the fruits of that have been RSE and what we have in our classrooms right now. We didn't speak up in time. We've lost ground. we must regain ground for Christ. We have a lot of encouraging things happening in our Christian schools. Christian Concern, Christian Legal Center, we're working with about 20 groups of Christian organizations in the country. We have a wonderful education team. I'm part of the legal side of that, but we have a dedicated education team. Steve Bigo, who many of you may know, is the head of that. So if you have any need of advice, whether it be about these issues that I've talked about here or starting a Christian school, Steve is the one to contact. If you are interested, we have a stand there at the back, and we have a lot of booklets that can help you with some of this information. Our website, www.christianconcern.com, a lot of resources for you about what we're teaching our kids, the rights you have. It has our contact information if you need to get in touch with us. Lastly, you'll see on each of your seats we have a packet there. Among them is a sign-up sheet for our weekly Christian news, which is a great resource. It rounds up the Christian news of the week as well as opinion pieces written by some of our staff. I frequently contribute to that. So please, I do encourage you to sign up because of GDPR. Without it, we can't send it to you. So please be aware of that. And I'll just close by saying that it's an honor to be here. You know, I was keen to fly out over here. So it's a wonderful organization, and I would second that support them if you can financially on a regular basis so they can hold events like this and continue the amazing work they're doing. But your kids are the future. The woke agenda, that's not going to stand for more than a generation. It is the culture of death in so many ways. Spiritual death. Salt and light always wins out. When you are a light on a hill, people see that. Live out the gospel for your kids and for their friends, because you will make a difference. Stand up and speak up, because without you, this agenda will go on and on and on. And we are at a critical time when finally we're seeing the structures fall down. We're seeing groups like Stonewall fall apart before our eyes, the Tower of Babel that it is. So I'll be praying for each and every one of you. It is a tough, tough battle to be a parent these days. But keep it up, and God bless you. And with that, we'll turn to some questions before we go for lunch.
Thank you so much, Roger, for all that you have said. So interesting, in my position as a head teacher, especially just to see those acts explained so clearly, and so much of that is on our side, as has been said in some of our Zooms that we've had during the year. We've had 2 or 3 different ones focusing on different areas, and it is something that we can perhaps not be sure, you know, what our rights are. And as Roger has said, to speak up and to speak out. I had a complaint from a parent right at the beginning of term, nothing to do with any of this, which thankfully I resolved, but it really sharpened me on the complaints policy of our school, which I obviously have had a hand in writing. But you may not know that schools have to have an extremely strict procedure for the complaints policy. Most schools have a 3-stage approach. The first stage is you complain to the teacher involved. Second stage, if that's not resolved to your satisfaction, is to speak to the head teacher. And the third stage is to the chair of governors. And that is put in place very specifically. My school is an independent one, so it's regulated by ISI, and that's the guidance that ISI give. So I did remind all my parents in the first week of term of what that procedure was and who to go to if they have any issue, because as a parent you don't always know, and in the heat of the moment something comes up. If your child comes home and they tell you maybe something to do with this, just so you really know and you're clear about what to do. Now I had a couple of questions which you actually covered, so I don't have anything particularly to ask myself. But we are very close to 1:45. But if anybody does have a question, does anybody have something they wanted to ask Roger? Michael. We've got the mic there.
Right, Roger. You've said a lot today, and probably the one around what's going on in schools, capturing the minds of the children. That presupposes a battle, and as you said, it's only the people in this room who are going to fight that battle. But more importantly, 2022, there was the issue around political impartiality, and we look, and I think even the Lord's hand was in that, because if I've got it right, and correct me, it was a private school, the American school. The parents got excited about what was being taught. They had the money then to actually kick the DFE. And we had the political impartiality, but nobody seems to actually know anything about it. But it's probably one of the most powerful weapons that parents have if, and I say this very lovingly, none of this stuff is interesting reading. But actually, without it, how are you going to be equipped? Sorry, it's not a very good question, but can you just say a little bit about political impartiality and the guidance? Because I think it's a tool that parents could use, but you've got to make the effort to find out. And it's also one where probably it came into schools and nobody's read it. I'm not being disrespectful because people are busy. I'll be quiet. Thank you.
No, that's great. And before I answer that question, I'll just say that I am here for the day, and I will be back there for much of it. So if you have other questions, that more private questions you want to ask, I'm here for you. But yes, in the Education Act, there is a prohibition on political indoctrination of children. That's at both secondary and primary level, and there is a duty of neutrality, political neutrality, that accompanies that. So there are two different sections in the same statute. So when we think of, we often think of political activity and indoctrination as, well, it's Tories or Labour, and that's not it. Anything that has political substance. So often you hear the thing that equality and diversity, that is a political movement. When you look at Pride, they are fighting for political rights. They are wanting to change the system. And if you are, the same with gender identity, they're not respecting the law. They have principles that they're trying to make the law, and they are, these organizations are also in Parliament lobbying. That is political activism. And so when Stonewall is too heavily involved in your children's school, when there is a palpable political message that is being taught to your children, then you need to say, this is prohibited. There is a statutory obligation to not do this type of activity, and you need to stop. And that is enforceable in the courts as well. But that also applies to critical race theory for those who, anything that is political in nature, it goes across the board.
Roger, I just thank you once more for coming and for your time. So we share our appreciation.